everyone here, those who are joining us live today, and those who may be watching this on demand. We're so grateful for your continued participation and engagement. If you are on here with us live and you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat function, and we'll work to get to them on the back end of the conversation. In some occurrences, I'll bring them up in real time. But I'm so excited to bring you our guest today, Dr. James Doty. Dr. Doty is a neurosurgeon, the author of the book Into the Magic Shop. And prior to starting, we were just talking about his upcoming book, which I'm sure he'll share a little bit with us today, which will be coming out on May 7th. He certainly has a resume many of you likely have seen in advance that doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'm not going to get into the granular specifics, but just to highlight a few things. Dr. Doty has served in multiple capacities beyond medicine. He's been an entrepreneur and an inventor, as he shares in the book, and I trust will share a little bit with us today, has amassed what society may point to as success. He's been on perceivably the highest of highs, and again, what society may point to as the lowest of lows. Yet through it all, he has learned some invaluable lessons that I know and believe will be of great importance to us all as we strive to get just a little bit better incrementally and take care of our mental well-being and just live a life of compassion and kindness. He actually is the founder and director of CCARE, which stands for the Center of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University. With all that being said, again, Dr. Doty, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you and to all of your listeners. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Would you mind sharing just a brief overview of your career up until this point, and then a high-level overview, too, of what CCARE is and does?
Sure. All of us have a backstory. As some of your listeners know, and you know certainly, I grew up in a challenging environment. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, unfortunately chronically depressed, attempted suicide, and multiple times. And we were on public assistance. And the reason I bring that up, of course, is essentially accomplishing anything in that type of an environment is very challenging. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term adverse childhood experiences. So for me, even thinking of going to college was a stretch. But fortunately, I met a person, and this in some ways emphasized the reality that all of us have the ability to change the life of at least one person, and in fact, one person every day. But a woman interacted with me that gave me a set of tools that allowed me to change the trajectory of my life. And as a result, I was able to imagine that I could go to college. I went to University of California, Irvine, although I did not graduate initially. I then went to Tulane Medical School in New Orleans and did a neurosurgery residency in the Army at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Left the military after my obligation was completed, since they had paid my way through medical school, and then was in private practice, but ultimately got involved in a company that makes a stereotactic radiosurgery device called Accuray, and the technology is called the CyberKnife. But as part of that, the inventor of that was at Stanford, and the company was having some challenges. So I agreed to raise money to save the company. I had actually believed so much in the technology, I had invested in the company. And in fact, a colleague of mine who was very wealthy bought the first unit outside of Stanford. Anyway, that led me to accept an academic appointment at Stanford while running the company, which was nearby Stanford. So I became the CEO of the company and then a faculty member at Stanford. I was there for well over 20 years and actually am still there, although I'm not practicing neurosurgery. In 2008, because of my interest, if you will, in what motivates people to do good and be their best selves, led me to found a center and fund it at Stanford called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And there we have studied for the last many years not only the neuroscience of compassion and self-compassion, but also its effect on one's physiology and how it relates to mental and physical health and longevity. We've also developed a number of interventions or programs um, that we offer to not only Stanford students and faculty, but also the general public, as well as first responders, such as police officers, um, and also to corporations, because what we know now is that when you imbue a corporate entity with compassion in an authentic way, this has a profound effect on what I would say presenteeism. You know, there's something that's common in corporate entities called absenteeism.
Yes.
And actually, when you imbue a corporate entity authentically with compassion, you dramatically increase presenteeism, you increase creativity, you increase productivity, you decrease healthcare costs, and actually you decrease human resources costs. So it's a win-win for everybody. So not only in the corporate environment, but everybody actually in the world.
Thank you for the in-depth overview. And obviously, as someone who's read the book and familiar with your story, the track that you followed follows with the book, of course. And there's so many points to pull out of there. But I'd love to, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a brief overview of kind of, you know, that period in your life where you were at Accuray. And as you described it in the book, you know, you woke up with a net worth of $75 million. And then that, you know, at what you believed was your highest of highs had come crashing down. Would you kind of walk us through what that, you know, downward spiral looked like? Because from my vantage point, that's kind of what led you into the founding of CCARE and this realization that there was more to life than wealth.
Well, coming from my background, it's probably not surprising that I bought the typical Western capitalist narrative that to be happy, I had to quote unquote be successful. Success is defined by money, power, position. So I went on that path. And when I mentioned this woman who changed the trajectory of my life, I was 12 at the time, 13 or so. And I was obviously not mature enough to fully understand what she taught me. So I chased after those things. And in fact, I made a list of 10 things, and that included owning a Rolex watch. I had met a person who was in a powerful position, and he was wearing this beautiful Rolex, and he really impressed me, or at least his Rolex did. I was walking actually down the street one day and saw a fellow driving a silver Porsche Targa, and I said, I have to have one of those. And so I put that on my list. And then I had a friend whose family was very wealthy, and they lived in a mansion. I said, I have to have a mansion. So I made all of these lists of things and thought that if I did X, Y, and Z, which are the typical methods of success. I went to college, I went to medical school, I became a physician, a neurosurgeon, I was an entrepreneur. And so I had, if you will, reached the pinnacle of what society defines as success. And unfortunately, each time I accomplished something, I kept waiting for this sense of fulfillment or feeling that, wow, okay, I'm okay. You know,
Mm.
I'm no longer insecure. I don't have shame anymore. And at every peak, if you will, I did not feel that way at all, because the problem was I was looking for external affirmation of myself. And
Mm.
I'm sure some of your listeners have experienced this, that the reality is you cannot take care of your insecurities, your shame, uh, by thinking that external affirmation is going to deal with that. This involves an internal journey of self discovery or self awareness, if you will. And ultimately, you realize that the only way you can become happy is if you allow yourself to be happy. And you have to change your perception, and you have to stop looking outside of yourself. And this is part of the problem, is so many people look outside themselves thinking that if only I do X, Y, or Z, or if I wish to the universe, magic is going to happen and I'm going to feel okay about myself. And unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. It's the complete opposite. So, as you were mentioning, here I reached the pinnacle of success, at least by societal standards. I uh, lived in a penthouse that overlooked the city of San Francisco. I had a Ferrari, a Porsche, BMW, a Mercedes, and a Range Rover. All I had a home down in Newport Beach overlooking the bay. I had a villa in Florence. Actually, I was in the process of buying a 6,500-acre island in New Zealand, flying around in private jets, and it was interesting because all of my quote unquote friends said, "Man, you haven't made life is so great for you. You have everything." And frankly, I was never more miserable and unhappy at any time
Mm,
in my life than when I had quote unquote everything.
wow.
And so, as you alluded to, at the pinnacle of my success, here I've gone from rags to riches. The dot-com crash happened, and I lost almost $80 million in 6 weeks. And in fact, I was $3 million in debt, and I had borrowed $15 million from the bank. And at that time, if you had stock in a publicly traded company, um, even though you were not allowed to cash out because of a lock-in agreement, which is very common for founders or investors. Um, Sorry about that.
It's
That
okay.
should not have happened. Um, anyway, at that time, um, if you had stock in a company, you could get a loan against it. So I got a loan for 15 million, which allowed me to buy this penthouse and this villa and this island and all these different cars and things. And so with the dot-com crash, I suddenly am $3 million in debt. And what happens in that situation, you suddenly become good friends with two people. One is your banker because he wants his money, and one is your lawyer because you need to take care of a lot of legal issues. Uh, Long story short, I had to pretty much sell everything to pay the bank back. And but one interesting thing that happened was that I had donated a bunch of stock to charity because I felt, since I'd been so fortunate, I was going to give money away. And of course, that would probably also fill this void where people would say, "Oh, what a great guy. He's giving money away." Um, but So my lawyer, in discussion with him, because I had a lot of different assets I had to deal with and legal issues, he said to me, he said, "You know, Jim, it turns out that we actually did not file the paperwork. So you actually don't have to give that stock away." And this was stock in a company that hadn't gone public yet. And so I went through a period of reflection. In fact, I went down to my house in Newport Beach and spent several days there, sort of trying to figure out what happened. Uh, and what I realized happened was that I had misunderstood everything. And what I mean by that is that I had, if you will, manifested all of these things, but I didn't realize the difference between what I thought I wanted and what I actually needed.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is essentially what I was telling you, that I thought, wow, if I get this, car, this house, whatever, I was suddenly going to be happy, and I wasn't. And I also realized that although I was a doctor and obviously cared for people, the real motivation, though, was that people would look up to me. I'm a doctor, I'm
Mm,
a neurosurgeon, I'm affluent, I'm wealthy. And uh, uh, I had to change my perspective ultimately because I realized that unless I looked at the world through the lens of service, caring for others, then this void that I had, this emptiness, was never going to be filled. And that was actually the lesson that this woman, Ruth, uh, was trying to teach me. I just was not in a position to learn it at that time. And unfortunately, many years passed. And while I did achieve a great deal, in some ways I was still lost. And so after that period of reflection, I changed my perspective to one of being of service and looking through that lens. And what I tell people is that when you do that, you actually get everything else you want or need, but that should always be your focus. And so when I did that, everything changed. And in fact, what I tell people is, I went from rags to riches to rags again. And but ultimately, I achieved incredible riches, and it wasn't really just money at all. It primarily was in the depth of relationships and experiences that I ended up having, and the interactions with people. And as an example, I founded the center at Stanford. The Dalai Lama ultimately became our founding benefactor, and there's an interesting story there that if we have time, I'll tell you about. But and then he and I became friends. I became chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, and this led me on the path of meeting some of the greatest spiritual and religious leaders in the world, including Eckhart Tolle, Amma, the Hugging Saint, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, Pope Francis, Byron Katie, Warner Earhart, and a whole number of others who I actually not only became friends with, but in some cases, a counselor, a friend, an advisor. And what's extraordinary about those individuals is that they live above their dogma. Their primary interest is, do you love? Do you care? Do you accept people?
mm,
Are you non judgmental? And that's really something to remember for each of us because there's a tendency to join a religion and get the idea that somehow you're superior or better than other people. And in these individuals' eyes, there's nothing further from the truth. We're all special human beings who deserve love. There is no superior, inferior. Everybody deserves dignity and respect. And while the dogma can be beneficial for many, many people, fundamentally, these individuals live above that dogma. And that's why it's interesting because people will sit there and say, well, why is it that these people accept you and you're not a believer? And because the dogma is completely unimportant. And these people can read an individual in a microsecond. And
mm,
so they know if your heart is pure, also that your intention is correct, then they embrace you. And at
mm.
least that's been my experience.
So much to unpack from that, and again, thank you for giving context into your story. And I obviously I know you opened up about this in your book, so you've been willing to share the dark pieces of life. And as you told me on the front end, I guess there's even darker pieces. Maybe we can unpack that in another interview. I'd love to know, Dr. Doty, as it relates to your world as a neurosurgeon. You touched on this in the book as well, but there's this common perception, and I think some of it is accurate, some of it is a stigma that exists. But folks in medicine are often very type A, right? They're very technical driven. You go in as a patient, and you don't always feel the most warmth and care and compassion from your practitioner. And you mentioned about an experience that happened in the book where I think the woman's name was June, if I'm not mistaken. She had connected with you on a human level. She was an opera singer, and she had told you leading up to her brain surgery, how important it was for her to be able to continue her passion and her love. I'm curious how, as you discovered this spirituality and this introspection and this connectedness to self, you navigated that as a high performer, wherein you had to like be able to compartmentalize in a way that you could still perform, but you deployed the compassion, empathy to let them know that you care. I know I'm giving you a long-winded question, but what I'm trying to help listeners understand is how we can still be really good at what we do and very technical, but not lose our care for others in pursuit of that technicality and that expertise.
So I think there are a couple points here, and training residents, I think it's always been important to emphasize the following. I would say that neurosurgery is a very technically demanding profession, but I would also suggest that just as important is not only the surgery, but the interaction and the connection you have to the patient. And the reason I say that is important is that, as you pointed out, there are some physicians or surgeons who are rude, brusque, arrogant, and many of them may, in fact, be technically proficient. But if you don't care, that has a huge negative impact on the patient. And numerous studies have demonstrated that during an interaction with the patient, if you, as an example, lean into them, if you touch them, if you reassure them, if you spend time with them, that many of the measures we look at in terms of outcomes are dramatically improved. As an example, if you create a comforting and soothing environment preoperatively, then typically the patient needs less anesthesia. They don't exhibit as much inflammation from the procedure itself. They need less in terms of painkillers. Their length of stay is decreased. Their complication rate and infection rates are decreased. Their length of stay and is decreased, as well as their readmissions. So we track admissions, readmissions less than 30 days after a procedure, and those are dramatically decreased. So on every measure, being thoughtful, being kind, being compassionate to a patient has a profound, profound effect. Now, you mentioned the difficulty in switching, if you will, from being a technician with a job to do versus being a kind, caring physician. And yes, you do have to compartmentalize, because if you start thinking about the patient, and you mentioned June, if you start thinking about the patient, then of course you have an emotional reaction to that. And you start thinking about, well, what if I fail, or what if something goes wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And if you get into that mode, obviously you've switched on your sympathetic nervous system, your flight, fight, or freeze response, which has a huge negative impact in the sense that it results in the release of different neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine or epinephrine, not only in the brain, but also systemically. And then you're not able to perform. You're not able to think about different alternatives in terms of past experience, because you're being reactive, which limits your choices. So if you're able to not be affected by that and essentially focus on the task at hand, I mean, that's what you need to do. And the best surgeons are able to do both of those. But it takes practice and it takes intention. It's always interesting in the operating room. having worked with and trained a lot of surgeons, there's a subset of surgeon who they come into the operating room insecure and afraid. And so if there's a mistake, they always blame someone else,
Mm.
or scream or throw an instrument, which of course is completely inappropriate. But unfortunately, what that does too is it affects everyone else in the OR and makes them tense and anxious, which then leads to a huge series of potentially negative consequences. The surgery takes longer. They require more blood. They require more anesthesia. More mistakes are made because people are anxious. So if you're able to keep the environment, if you will, quote unquote, light, if you smile, if you're complimentary, and if something does go wrong, if instead of pointing in others, you sit there and say, what was it that I could have done to prevent this? Then
Mhm.
it's really hard to get angry at yourself. Because the reality is you're the captain of the ship, you're in charge, and if mistakes are made, by definition, it's your fault. And if you keep that always as your perspective, then I think that creates a much more productive environment. And people want to work with you because you cannot imagine the number of nurses and technicians who do not want to work with a lot of doctors.
Yeah, I'm sure there are plenty. I had read a few books by Atul Gawande. I don't know if you're familiar with his
Sure, of
writing, and
course.
I'm kind of, I have no background in medicine, but I'm a nerd for it because of the fallibility of the human, right? The realization that folks in medicine are like all of us, and they're going in to perform procedures after they're dealing with traffic on the road, or illness with their own kids. And so that has always fascinated with me. How do the best of the best perform at their best in all industries? And I bring that up because I remember Dr. Gawande had mentioned about an experience where sometimes nurses were fearful of speaking up even when they knew there was an error about to occur because of that culture that was set. And that leads me to another thought of culture within business environments. And you share a unique perspective in this because you've operated in the business world. We serve folks within Mindful Journey who probably have no background and perhaps maybe not a deep care in medicine, but are immersed in driving teams, leading organizations. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the transferable skills that you learned in leading teams in medicine, in an OR, and also in business that can be useful for those of us listening in here who are leaders, whether in a team of 2 people or a team of 2,000? What are some characteristics and essentials to create a culture of belonging?
Well, I would say one of the first things is to get rid of the notion that you know everything. And this is one of the biggest detriments to people being open and honest. There's a Buddhist saying that you should have a beginner's mind. And so I think that is one thing that's important. I think, unfortunately, individuals who are in leadership positions often think that pontificating about themselves or telling people how important they are while diminishing the abilities, experiences of others, that somehow that motivates people. And of course, that does not. Everybody has unique experiences, everybody can contribute. So I think one of the most important skills is actually listening to people. And also making people feel that expressing themselves in an honest way, which can include being highly critical of the leader or the what's happening in the corporate environment, that should be rewarded and encouraged. None of us are perfect human beings, and that's just reality. And anyone who somehow thinks they are uh, is a fool. And so I think that having humility, recognizing the dignity of every person who works with you is critically important because this gives them the sense that your goal is about the mission and accomplishing the mission or improving the corporate environment. Um, not your ego being involved in how important you are, or telling people that you're the reason the company is having success.
Mhm.
And I think
Yes.
also reaching out to people, I get asked a lot about some of these questions, and I always tell leaders, you should make an effort to go and try to meet everybody in the corporate entity, or make sure that people are aware of you and you are aware of them and want to ensure their success, and actually have an open, free line of communication. And this means from the person who may be in the lowest position to the person in the highest position. And I don't mean that in a negative context about anyone who works for you. But
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I mean, I can always tell a good doctor simply by watching them when they come to the floor. A good doctor is one who knows the nurses' names, makes an effort to speak to them, treat them like a human being, asks about their family, how they're doing. That person also recognizes that they cannot do their job unless every team member does their job. And that includes the person who sweeps the floors. That includes the person who serves the meals. That includes the person who empties the bedpans. Every one of those is important to me because they allow for me to be successful. And so I have and try to go out of my way to demonstrate the respect I have for them, whatever position they are. And so I think that again makes people feel better. It makes them feel important. It allows them to recognize that they're part of an entity that works together um, to create success. And in my case, obviously, it's the success is how my patients do. But in a
Mhm.
corporate environment, it means increased productivity, increased creativity. When you imbue a corporate entity with compassion, it changes everything. As an example, healthcare costs dramatically increase. Why is that? Well, unfortunately, stress and anxiety increase illness. And whether it's a stress-related illnesses like headache, back pain, GI upset, fatigue, or actual uh, uh, illnesses related to infection or other types of things, all of these are aggravated by stress and anxiety. And so if you create a happy environment, you decrease healthcare costs. You also decrease human resource costs. And the reason is because people don't quit.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
People don't avoid promotions. And as a result, recruitment costs are decreased. And because people are happy to take promotions, of course, that improves the organization. So there are all these huge hidden benefits of caring for others.
Mhm. Mhm. Would you mind sharing about the difference between compassion? Because what you're saying right now leads me to think about, just having empathy for others and compassion. But for my understanding and viewpoint, there's a difference between the two, and would love to hear from your perspective what that difference is between the two. What is compassion? What is empathy?
Yeah, there are a number of terms that people can confuse or think are similar or the same. And one of those is empathy and compassion, and also sympathy and pity. Um, so, compassion is the recognition of another's suffering with a motivational desire to alleviate that suffering. To have compassion, you have to have empathy, and empathy is being able to stand in another's shoes and feel what they're feeling. And so, when you're compassionate, you can look at a person and get a sense of their suffering. Now, I have to caution because that sense can be one of two things. One is cognitive at an intellectual level, and the other is affective or at emotional level. And the reason these make a difference is if it's at a cognitive level, Then you have sympathy and pity. Sympathy being that you recognize their suffering, but you have no emotional context for it. It's simply a cognitive exercise. You look at them, say, oh, they must be suffering. Pity is the same thing, except you look at it from a level of superiority. I pity them, they're beneath me. To be truly compassionate, you look at a person at eye level, eye to eye, we're the same. So I think that's a very, very important differentiation between those.
I like how you phrased the compassion, and I didn't catch it all. Would you mind sharing that again, that definition of compassion? Because I think you said then to have compassion, you need to have empathy, and I've not heard it framed that way. Really liked it.
Well, so compassion is the recognition of another's suffering with a motivational desire to alleviate that suffering. And the reason I separated cognitive from affective, affect is empathy in the sense that you're feeling the other's pain.
Hmm.
Well, on a cognitive level, you're not. You're simply intellectually recognizing pain.
Hmm.
It's like the difference between looking at a photograph of somebody being tortured versus actually feeling the torture yourself while you're thinking about that.
Hmm.
So that's the differentiation. Now, the other aspect is kindness. Kindness has nothing to do with suffering at all. Kindness is just trying to help another human being. And that's another, I think, important differentiator is living in this world. Everything doesn't necessarily have to be oriented around suffering. It's simply being a thoughtful human being, recognizing that on some level, all of us are suffering. And if you also can give people simply respect for them as human beings, and they may not be suffering, and that can be a smile, it can be opening a door, just making an individual's life easier, I think is something that if you do that intentionally, your life will actually be better.
Yeah, I love that. I love that thought, and I think you'd shared some research actually in the book around how kindness does make your life better from a brain physiology perspective, and what it does for you. In terms of, and you mentioned this on the front end, like when you're actually having the right intention, things are going to come to you that are favorable for you. Because your intention is pure. It's not, hey, I'm going to do this or give this favor, be kind because I want something in return. It's a genuine desire to help and to serve. And I love to hear that there is research that supports it, because I think we can, attract a certain population who may be more reactive toward others on the road, call it when there's traffic and they want to honk back at someone when someone honks at them. And if they can pause in that moment to hear that there are actually benefits to being kindness, even if that's not their pure intent to want to be kind to that person, maybe we'll slow them down enough to say, I can treat this person as though they are going through something that I know nothing about, which what I'm understanding and hearing from you, that's empathy at its core, trying to be in their shoes and understand why they're maybe honking the horn at you, or why they cut you off, or why they flicked you off. Is there anything that you could offer to us as listeners as to how we might be less reactive in those moments if kindness is not deeply already rooted in our DNA, or if we view it as some woo woo elusive concept? What can we do in moments of potential pain that others are seemingly inflicting on us so that we can bring kindness?
Well, I think what you're talking about is emotion regulation. And I think that's hard for a lot of people, especially if they themselves have had challenging or chaotic backgrounds. As an example, if you have a parent who punishes you or constantly screams at you, that becomes the norm for you. And so there are a few aspects of that that I think we have to recognize. One of those is understanding that each and every one of us carries baggage from our childhoods that oftentimes we are not self-aware of, or it's at an unconscious level. And unfortunately, for many people, that baggage, it drives our interactions with others. It oftentimes results in us choosing partners based on the baggage we're carrying and not on healthy reasons. And so one aspect of that is not being reactive to triggers. And there's a book which I'm sure you're familiar with called Man's Life's or A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I'm
yes.
sure many of your listeners have heard of him. And while a quote is often attributed to him, no one's been able to find that he actually said it, but it's alluded to in the book, and that is between stimulus and response, there's a pause, and within that pause lies your freedom. And you gave the example of being in traffic. All of us have been cut off by somebody. And of course, for many people, their first reaction is a hand gesture or a profanity. And what I always say is that if you look at it from a different perspective, it changes everything. As an example, if you think about the person who cut you off, and if you say, well, wow, maybe his wife is in the car and she's 9 months pregnant, her water's broken, and she's bleeding. And he's trying to get her to the hospital.
Yes.
Well, suddenly, in a microsecond, your perspective changes, right?
Yes.
You're no longer angry. You're going, oh my God, yes, I understand why you did that. Gosh, let me help you. And
Yes.
And you see, in a microsecond, you changed your perspective. And that is a ability that all of us have. It's simply taking the time to pause for a few seconds. And what happens then is that you don't immediately switch to stimulation of your sympathetic nervous system. It allows you to modulate that response and remain in or switch to increasing your tone of your parasympathetic nervous system, which makes you much more thoughtful and deliberative and able to make a much wider range of choices than the limited choices that occur when your sympathetic nervous system is engaged.
Whew, lots to unpack there. I would love to continue this dialogue with you post interview because there's so much more I wanted to ask, and I realize I want to be cognizant of our time. We've got about 15 minutes still, if that's good for you. And there are a few questions that I'd love to get to because I ask them of every guest, and one of them, Dr. Doty, is personal. I know you, again, for folks who haven't read your story or your book, they're not as familiar with your background, but one of the things that we're trying to do in these conversations is to normalize and humanize this shared experience. I think we're living in a time right now where folks are constantly comparing themselves to others at more rapid rates because of social media and because of this ability to get instant gratification in almost any moment. We post a picture or post something about our business and we get, likes and comments, etc. But as a result, we can feel inadequate in certain moments. So there's obviously so many studies out there supporting, increased rates of depression and loneliness. The Surgeon General came out last year and said it's higher than it's ever been. I preface with forthcoming question to give you intention as to why I ask it every time. And the question very simply is to be able to let the people listening in realize that we all face hardships and have challenges. So the question is, what's the most challenging thing that you've gone through in your life? And then what do you recall having done to get through it?
Well, this is not to avoid answering your question. Every human being is going to have significant challenges that can affect them to their core. And oftentimes they then translate that into there's nothing they can do to change the outcome. And there are instances, of course, where that may in fact be true. One of the heroes that I have who's given me great insights is a fellow by the name of Epictetus. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He was a Greek or Roman slave. And his comment was, I cannot change the circumstances which I'm in, but I do have the ability to choose how I react to them. And I think that's the most important thing. And I've had many experiences that I've translated into a scenario. And the problem oftentimes is we create a narrative which has us react to an experience which is looking at a future which has not occurred yet. And as a result, we react to a future, not to the situation at hand. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. I had a situation recently where an accusation was made against me, which was completely untrue. And it appeared as though it was going to have huge negative consequences, both personally and professionally. And it appeared after talking to multiple people, and I know I'm being vague, but after talking to multiple people, they said, well, this is going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it. And you can imagine how much fear, anxiety, stress, and this related to a professional situation. And ultimately, this actually even ended up at the medical board. And so I met with two attorneys who said, well, they're not your friend. They're not interested in the truth. There's no way we can introduce the truth here. And potentially, I mean, this was going to result in revocation of my license. Now, imagine at the end of your medical career, something like this occurring. And, where you've always thought, well, I'm a great doctor. I work hard. I have empathy, compassion. And here, because of a false narrative, that is all at risk. And if your identity is based on that, imagine, the fear, the heartache, etc. Well, fortunately, I did not listen to either of those people and pursued the matter. And, after 3 years and $200,000, everything was dismissed and it went away and there wasn't an issue anymore. But that was extraordinarily, extraordinarily painful. I mean, here you come from these extraordinarily challenging circumstances. You've worked really hard. Mm-hmm. And then something that's at the core of who you are is, at risk. And so, yeah, but, as I said, though, I did have that initial fear reaction and I ultimately controlled it and was able to sit there and just say, it is what it is, and I will do the best I can. And that's all I can do. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say you're not going to fight, but it's to say I couldn't control anything beyond what I did. And now, fortunately, it came out in my favor. Life, though, does not always guarantee that the victor is right. Mm-hmm. But it turned out fine. And so, again, you also have to know yourself. And regardless of what happens, you have to know that you did the right thing and you did the best you could. And it doesn't matter what other people think, although it seems a little bit. Uh, uh, so, I think that it all has to be put in perspective. And the other thing that happens sometimes, although this might not be the same, but things that we think are really important that people are going to judge us by, to be honest with you, most people don't give a shit.
Yeah.
You know,
It's
it's go ahead.
Yeah, it's so true. It's funny. I've read, and you probably are way more attuned to this and familiar with the raw data than I am. But research has shown that we have over 6,000 thoughts per day, and 95% of them are ones we had yesterday, and 80% of those 95 are negative. And then there's not a caveat, but just some additional they didn't put a number to it, but some additional research coupled on top of that in another article. I don't even know, research is probably not the right word because I don't think it was proven, but it said that so much of those negative thoughts are based upon what it is others are thinking of us. And most often they're not thinking of us. So it's like we occupy our headspace with all of these things of what doesn't even end up happening. And I'd love to hear from your perspective because you just went through something like that. Did you rely on the four techniques that Ruth had shared? And for our listeners, actually, it'd be a good opportunity to share what those four things were of, calming your body and emptying the mind and the opening the heart, setting the intention. Did you rely on those, number one? And then also, even if you didn't, would you mind sharing what those four things are for folks listening in?
Well, to be honest with you, I was so shell-shocked by this thing initially that I just ruminated for a while and had a lot of difficulty with sleep. But once I stepped away from the situation, yeah, so of course, one is when you come from a traumatic family environment, of course, because it's so unpredictable and chaotic, you're always waiting for something to happen. It's like being in a war zone and being a soldier, right? And this is where post-traumatic stress disorder comes from. So one is relaxing the body with intention. And of course, this is one of the first steps of mindfulness, a body scan, where you, with intention, relax the muscles of your body. The other is to do either a breathing exercise or have a mantra that allows you to uh, focus and be present, if you will, because our clearest thinking is when we're present in the moment, and uh, and that's really important. And there are a variety of techniques to get there. And like I said, one is a breathing exercise, and the goal of this, again, just like the relaxation exercise, is to shift you from engagement of your sympathetic nervous system to engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest system, which calms you. It calms you mentally, it calms you physiologically. And then of course it's the you mentioned opening the heart, the recognition that, one, you're suffering by all these negative comments that you make to yourself, and oftentimes many of us are more critical about ourselves than we're about any person we know. I mean, we really beat ourselves up that much. And so understanding that that's a false narrative, and if you want to call it changing the channel of the radio station, which is the metaphor I use in the book, but changing your negative self-talk to one of affirmation and positivity is critically important. And the more you do it, the less loud, if you will, the radio station is, or the less frequent those negative thoughts are. Now, I will assure you that I don't know anyone who gets rid of them 100%. So if you don't get rid of them 100%, you are not a failure. You're a human being. But you can certainly modulate them in a variety of different ways and decrease them. And also don't believe them, even though they come up periodically. So you do not react to them. And that's one of the classic techniques of mindfulness. Now, one that I think is important and that I added on here from my own experience is, again, compassion for self. But when you're kind to yourself, it also changes your outlook, because if you're always beating yourself up, you look through the lens that other people are a problem or they have issues. And then you become hypercritical to everyone else. So being able to understand that everyone is suffering and having their own challenges affects how you interact and react to people. Because instead of being reactive to them, and as an example, if somebody's aggressive with you, you come back and are aggressive to them, that only escalates the situation.
Definitely.
Versus if you sit there and say, wow, what's going on with you? I'm surprised. Clearly, it's not about what's going on between you and I. There's something else going on. Why don't you tell me about it? Or I'm happy to listen. And that will change that situation. Um, and of course, clarifying your intention is taking the time to process why you want what you want. And again, you have to have some degree of self-awareness to be able to do that. You mentioned how young people or people in present society want. And unfortunately, we've created a narrative that is to the detriment of so many people. And one is the narrative of what success means,
Mhm.
which is wealth, position, and power. And that if you get that, you'll be happy. Unfortunately, many people translate that happiness as people looking up to you. And of course, that's an empty promise. But the reason that is because we've created a society that seemingly rewards people who chase after that. And of course, those people are not fulfilled oftentimes. So then they want to show off that they have these things and then impress people that, wow, see, I'm smiling, I'm happy I have all these things. And when in fact, I know many, many extraordinarily wealthy people, and I would not want to change lives with them in any way, shape,
Wow.
or form. And also I've lived that life. So I think this idea that if you want, uh, that you're correct. Yeah, everybody wants, but again, it's often an empty promise. The best thing you can want is for others to be happy, because when that's the case, you end up being happy and are rewarded. It's a sad statement that something like almost 80% of high school students want to be either an influencer, a celebrity, or wealthy.
Wow.
And
I've not heard that before. Wow.
yeah, and the problem is that we also created a narrative, and I don't know if you recall this, but at one time there was this idea that everybody should be a winner. Like,
Hmm.
there are 10 people in a race and everybody gets a medal. And the
Right.
reality is life doesn't work that way.
That's
There
right.
are people who win the race and there are people who don't win the race. And this notion that everyone is entitled has created a narrative where a lot of young people somehow feel entitled but don't feel they have to do the work.
Yes.
And that is not reality in any way, shape, or form. And when you coddle your children and tell them this, all it does, unfortunately, it destroys their motivation and makes them extraordinarily self centered. And it is the antithesis of being of service. It is being spoiled and entitled. And this has huge, huge negative consequences and has created a huge population of people who really feel this way, which is sad. And life does not work that way in any way, shape, or form.
No, it's so true. So true and beautifully shared. I know we're at the conclusion of our time, so I'm going to pause there with my question. I did see a question that came in from the
You can, you
guests.
can, you can ask a question. I have a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. There's a great question that I'd love to hear the answer to that had come in. Guest said, "Thank you for this insightful conversation, Doctor. I'm curious to know if you were to do life all over again, what would you repeat and what would you change?"
Um, well, I know there are people who say, well, I want to change anything because that's made me who I am. And on some level, that's true, but there are a few painful experiences. I can tell you that many of the negative experiences that I've had relate to the use of alcohol or drugs. So I would say, while on some level they seem interesting at the time, that is usually not the best path to take. And I would certainly avoid that retrospectively. And yes, I learned some lessons from that, but I didn't need to go through that. The other thing is, if you grow up with insecurity and shame, uh, oftentimes, again, you are frequently hypercritical of others. And the reality is, when you look at others and you feel that way, oftentimes it's your own insecurity speaking about them. It's not them themselves. And I think that takes a moment to reflect and to get insight into why you feel that way. As an example, on some level, I'm known in some circles, but I always say I'm a B-lister, probably not an A-lister. And what I mean by that is, there are people who are more prominent out there, or who are doing something, or who did more books, or whatever it is. And you sit there and go, that bastard, or, why isn't that happening to me? Or why did they get that? And it's a reflection of me, it's not of them. And I just have
Wow,
to
it's
accept
powerful.
that it is what it is. And, it's like, as an example, you sent me a video, which I responded to.
Yes.
And all of us want to try to sort of elevate ourselves. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And if somebody reaches out who you admire and they go, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. That's great. Yeah, let's get together and do that. You sit there and go, wow, that's cool. you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's also the subset who you send them a note and they go, who are you? Or why are you
Yeah.
calling me? Or frankly, the most sad thing is they ignore you.
Yeah.
And I've certainly been in that position. So, I think not getting wrapped up in those feelings of inadequacy or insecurity. And I would say that all of us are okay. And when we get focused on what we think we want, this is the nature of suffering, because that's craving and attachment.
Yes.
And people get lost in that. And what it also does is, when you have this external goal, you're always focused on that, and you're not living in the present moment. And the thing, though, is that who we are as human beings doesn't happen out there in the future. It happens here on that journey. And so the most important thing is to be present, for those around you, to your family, for others, because at the end of the day, that's what makes you happy. People get lost, as I was saying, in having some external goal that they sit there and go, well, if I just do this, this is going to make me happy. And it just doesn't for the vast majority of people. So, and again, I'm not negating making goals and striving for them, but if you do that to the exclusion of everyone else or everything that's happened in your life, you may get there and you may receive a variety of accolades, but you're standing alone. And
Mhm.
um, I think that's a sad statement. And we see a lot of influencers or people who say, I'm able to run 100 miles, and my feet are bleeding, and but I
Yeah.
made it to the goal, and I get up at 3:30 in the morning, and blah 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 blah. And you go,
Yeah.
well, geez, I guess good for you.
Yeah.
And in some ways, people substitute this immense drive as a good thing always, and it's not always a good thing. It's very destructive and very detrimental in some ways.
Yes. Wow, that is very deep, Dr. Doty, and so very true. I've often felt that way as it relates to what you're saying about this influencer driven world right now. I'm somebody who obviously I post on social media regularly. I think I've got like 800 followers, so a small amount. And it's funny because I've been doing my work for prior to rolling out Mindful Journey, doing speaking, leadership training since 2013. And I've always shared with others that if it was only about the likes or the fame or the glamour that our society perceives that comes with something like working for yourself, I would have quit long ago because I've only got 800 followers, right? And I think that there is this obsession now with people seeing some of these influencers have amassed millions of followers and view that we need that to feel adequate. And it can be particularly harmful for folks who haven't done their own work introspectively. That's why I'm a big believer in the importance of slowing down and journaling and being mindful and practicing meditation. So I just wanted to reiterate kind of and piggyback off of what you were saying, because it's deeply powerful what you shared. And I firmly believe that we need social connection now more than ever before. There's one last thought I have on that because you might be interested on it. There's a movie called Into the Wild. Have you seen it?
Is this the one about the young man who went out and died in a bus?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And at the conclusion, as you probably recall, as he was dying, he said, "Happiness is only real when shared." And it's always struck me.
Yeah, and you look at that and you wonder, what pain this individual was going through. Um, Getting back to the influencer comment you made, it's interesting. I just saw something today, and somebody was pointing out that, quote unquote, an influencer, he was bragging about, well, I'm only 19 and I just bought this $3 million house. And then somebody pointed out and saying both the car and the house are rented. And again, the horrible, sad thing about this is that somebody would feel that creating a complete false narrative about who they are, what they've accomplished, is somehow okay or is going to make them feel better about themselves. And the sad thing is that somebody would go to such effort to create a complete false narrative about who they are. It's tragic. But the more tragic thing is the people who are watching who believe this, and they go, oh, this young person was able to do this and they have all these followers, and I'm just a loser because I'm not able to do any of that, and I'm not handsome or pretty, or I don't have this or that. And then this leads to many of these people spiraling down into this rumination and ultimately depression. And in many instances, as we've seen both with influencers as well as followers, they end up committing suicide. And nothing is more sad than that.
Yes.
And so uh, being careful about interpreting what's put out there as real or truth, I think, is something to really be aware of, because many of the influencers are just insecure, unhappy people who are using the wrong narrative to make people they think like them, and it's just very sad.
Yes, absolutely agreed. Well, Dr. Doty, I am deeply, deeply grateful for your commitment to us here today, for your time, for you answering my cold email. I'm glad the video message had resonated, and I'm grateful for your not just receptiveness to it, but like you mentioned, the reply, as I certainly get many of yeses, but many of nos too, and then many of messages that go unresponded to. So thank you very, very much. I hope that our paths cross in person sometime in the future. I'll send you this offline, the recording of this. And again, deeply grateful for you today.
Well, thank you, and thank your listeners. And what you're doing is important, so don't forget that.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Take care. See you,
Okay.
everyone.
Okay. Bye.